The wedding dress tore against the barbed wire as Evangeline Whitmore vaulted over the fence, her bare feet hitting the dusty ground with a thud that sent chickens scattering in every direction. Behind her, the church bells of Millfield continued their mournful toll, calling to a bride who was already 3 miles gone and running like the devil himself was on her heels. She didn't see the man until she collided with his chest, a wall of muscle and worn leather that sent her sprawling backward into the dirt. Above her loomed Cassandra Royce, though she didn't know his name yet, only that his eyes held the kind of steel that came from seeing too much war, and his hands moved to steady her with surprising gentleness. "Easy there, Wildcat," he said, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man who'd learned to command through bullets rather than books. "What's got you running like the whole world's on fire?" Evangeline scrambled to her feet, yanking the torn train of her dress free from a thorn bush. "None of your concern, stranger. Just let me pass." But Cassandra had already taken in the elaborate gown, the pearl tiara hanging askew in her auburn hair, and the wild panic in her green eyes. He'd made his fortune reading situations quickly, first on battlefields in distant territories, then in the cutthroat world of railroad expansion. This was a woman in genuine distress. "That depends," he said, not moving from her path. "You running to something or away from it?" "Away." The word burst from her lips like a gunshot. "Away from a man who thinks I'm property to be traded. Away from a life that ain't mine to live. Away from—" She stopped herself, breathing hard. "Why am I telling you this?" Because something in his weathered face invited confession, though she couldn't name what. Cassandra Royce had that effect on people, a magnetism born of absolute certainty in his own power and an unexpected capacity for understanding the desperate. "Because," he said, stepping aside but not away, "you recognize someone else who's been running." He gestured toward the horse tied to a nearby oak, its saddlebags bulging with the possessions of a man who traveled light and fast. "Difference is, I've been running towards something instead of away from it." The sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance, her father's men, no doubt, sent to retrieve the wayward bride before she could embarrass the family further. Evangeline's eyes darted between the approaching dust cloud and the stranger's calm face. "They'll be here soon," she whispered. "Then we'd better not be." Cassandra untied his horse with swift efficiency. "Can you ride?" "I can do anything I set my mind to." Something in her defiant tone made him smile, the first real smile that had crossed his features in months. "Good, because I've got a proposition." "For you, Miss Evangeline." Evangeline. He tested the name, found he liked the sound of it. "I need a woman, and you need a home. Seems to me we might be able to help each other out." Before she could ask what he meant, he'd swung her up behind him, and they were riding hard toward the horizon. The abandoned miller's house sat like a forgotten memory against the evening sky, its broken windows catching the last rays of sunset. As Cassandra brought his horse to a stop, Evangeline had been silent for the past hour, her arms locked around his waist as they put distance between themselves and Millfield, but he could feel the tension radiating from her small frame. "This'll do for tonight," he said, dismounting and reaching up to help her down. She accepted his assistance with the wariness of a wild animal that hadn't yet decided if he was predator or savior. Inside, Cassandra worked with the efficiency of a man accustomed to making temporary shelters comfortable. He started a fire in the old hearth, checked the windows for security, and produced provisions from his saddlebags with the same methodical care he'd once used to prepare for battle. "You said you needed a woman," Evangeline said finally, settling onto a dusty chair and tucking her torn skirts around her legs. "I'm assuming you don't mean the kind of need most men are thinking of." Cassandra looked up from where he was laying out his bedroll. "You assume correctly. Though I won't lie, you're beautiful enough to tempt a saint, and I'm far from sainthood." His directness made her flush, but she held his gaze. "No, what I need is a partner. Someone with steel in her spine and sense in her head." "For what?" He sat back on his heels, studying her in the firelight. "You ever heard of the Royce Railroad Company?" Her eyes widened slightly. Everyone in 3 states had heard of Royce Railroad, the company that had appeared seemingly from nowhere 5 years ago and proceeded to lay track faster and more efficiently than established lines that had been operating for decades. Rumor had it the owner was some kind of war hero turned business magnate, a man who could outfight, outthink, and outmaneuver anyone who stood in his way. "You're him," she breathed. "You're Cassandra Royce, guilty as charged." He stood, moving to the window to check the darkness beyond. "And right now, I'm about to undertake the biggest expansion in my company's history. I'm going to connect the eastern seaboard to the California territory through a route that will cut 3 weeks off current travel time." Evangeline leaned forward, caught despite herself by the excitement in his voice. That's impossible. The mountain ranges alone, not impossible. Difficult, expensive, and dangerous, but not impossible." He turned back to her, and she saw the fire that had driven him from battlefield success to business empire. "But it requires finesse as well as force. There are landowners to negotiate with, politicians to convince, competitors to outwit. And many of them won't take a meeting with a man they consider an upstart bachelor with more money than breeding." Understanding began to dawn on her face. But they would meet with a married couple, especially if the wife came from the right kind of family. The Whitmore family has been respected in these parts for generations. Your father may be a fool, but his name carries weight. Cassandra moved closer, his voice dropping to the persuasive tone that had closed 100 business deals. "I'm offering you a partnership, Evangeline, a marriage of minds and mutual benefit. You help me navigate society's expectations, and I give you the freedom to be more than any man's decorative possession." She stood abruptly, pacing to the broken window. "And what happens when your railroad is built? When you don't need the Whitmore name anymore? Then we renegotiate. Or we part as friends, both richer for the experience." He paused. "Though I suspect by then we'll have found reasons to make it permanent." The confidence in his voice made something flutter in her chest, something dangerous and entirely unwelcome. "You don't know me. I could be useless as a partner, or worse. I know you had the courage to run from a life that didn't fit you. I know you can ride and think on your feet and look a man in the eye when you speak to him." He smiled that rare smile again. "That's more than most society wives can claim." Outside, an owl called through the darkness, and Evangeline realized she was actually considering his mad proposal. This isn't how marriages are supposed to begin. "Neither is running away from your wedding," Cassandra pointed out. "But sometimes the unconventional path is the only one worth taking." 3 days later, Evangeline stood in the parlor of the finest hotel in Centerville, watching Cassandra negotiate with a group of land speculators who looked like they'd rather sell to the devil himself than to an upstart railroad man. She'd spent the intervening time learning everything she could about his business, poring over maps and contracts until her eyes burned, and discovering that Cassandra Royce was even more formidable than his reputation suggested. "Gentlemen," she interjected smoothly when the conversation reached an impasse, "surely we can find common ground here. After all, the railroad benefits everyone: increased property values, easier transport of goods, connection to broader markets." She moved to stand beside Cassandra, one hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture that spoke of wifely support, while her mind calculated angles and advantages. The effect was immediate. Where the men had been hostile and dismissive with Cassandra, they softened toward Evangeline, drawn by her natural grace and the Whitmore name she now carried. Within an hour, they had preliminary agreements that Cassandra had been fighting for all week. Remarkable, murmured Hiram Goldschmidt, the group's leader, as he shook their hands. Mrs. Royce, your husband is fortunate to have such a diplomatic partner. When the men left, Cassandra turned to her with something approaching awe. Where did you learn to do that? Same place you learned to fight wars, I suspect. Evangeline smoothed her skirts, trying to ignore the warmth that spread through her when he looked at her that way. By paying attention to what people want and figuring out how to give it to them, she paused. Or make them think you're giving it to them. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a recognition of equals, of minds that worked in similar patterns despite their different backgrounds. The marriage might have started as a business arrangement, but Cassandra was beginning to realize he'd found something far more valuable than a social asset. There's more, Evangeline continued, pulling a telegram from her reticule. While you were reviewing contracts this morning, I took the liberty of contacting my cousin Ophelia in Washington. She's married to a senator, and she owes me several favors. The federal land grants you've been trying to secure? She can arrange the right introductions. Cassandra stared at the telegram, then at her. You've been married to me for 3 days, and you're already revolutionizing my business practices. I told you I could do anything I set my mind to. But her smile was softer now, less defiant and more genuine. Besides, this railroad of yours, it's not just about profit, is it? You want to build something that lasts, something that connects people and places that have been isolated for too long. He nodded slowly. My unit was stationed in California during the territorial conflicts. Beautiful country, but cut off from everything. People there are practically living in a different century because it takes so long for news, supplies, people to get back and forth. This railroad could change that. Then we'll build it. The word we came out without conscious thought, but neither of them missed its significance. Together. That evening, as they sat in their hotel suite reviewing the day's progress, Cassandra found himself studying his wife's profile in the lamplight. She was bent over a map, marking potential routes with the focused intensity of a general planning. A campaign, and he realized with a start that somewhere in the past 72 hours, his practical arrangement had become something else entirely. Evangeline, he said quietly. She looked up, and the sight of her hair escaping its pins, ink staining her fingers, eyes bright with shared purpose, hit him like a physical blow. What if this becomes real? He asked out. She set down her pen, understanding immediately what he meant. What if it already has? The question hung in the air between them, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. Part 4. The test. The telegram arrived at dawn, delivered by a boy whose nervous energy suggested bad news before Cassandra even broke the seal. Evangeline, already dressed and reviewing morning correspondence, looked up as his face darkened. What is it? Trouble? He handed her the paper. Someone's been sabotaging our supply lines. 3 trains derailed in the past week, all carrying materials for the mountain passage. No casualties, but the delays will cost us months if we can't stop it. Evangeline studied the message, her mind already working through implications. Competitors? Most likely. The Baltimore and Ohio line has been losing contracts to us all year. Could be them, could be someone else who stands to lose money if we succeed. Cassandra was already moving, pulling on his coat and checking his sidearm with the automatic motions of a man who'd faced similar threats before. I need to get out there, assess the damage, coordinate security measures. We need to get out there, Evangeline corrected, standing and reaching for her traveling cloak. Absolutely not. His voice carried the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. This isn't a society meeting or a business negotiation. Someone is actively trying to stop us, and they've shown they're willing to use violence to do it. Evangeline faced him across the hotel room, her chin raised in the gesture he was learning meant she'd already made up her mind about something. Cassandra Royce, if you think I'm going to sit in this hotel room playing the helpless wife while someone tries to destroy everything we've worked for, you've gravely misjudged your partner. I've misjudged nothing. I've seen what sabotage can do to people who get in the way. This isn't about helplessness, it's about keeping you safe. Something in his tone made her pause. There was fear there, raw and unexpected, and she realized, with a start, that somewhere in their brief marriage, this had stopped being just business for him too. Safe won't build a railroad, she said more gently. And besides, whoever's doing this knows we're married. They know we work together. Separating now makes us both more vulnerable, not less. The argument was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time it was Jeremiah Pike, Cassandra's head of operations, a grizzled man who'd served under him in the territorial campaigns and followed him into the railroad business with unwavering loyalty. "Boss," Pike said without preamble, "we've got bigger problems. Just got word from our contacts in Baltimore someone's been spreading rumors that our financing is shaky, that we're using stolen federal money to fund construction. 3 major investors have already pulled out." Evangeline and Cassandra exchanged glances. A coordinated attack on multiple fronts was more serious than simple sabotage. "Any idea who's behind it?" Cassandra asked. "Working on it, but whoever they are, they're smart and they're connected. This isn't some local competitor. This is someone with reach and resources." Evangeline stepped forward. "Mr. Pike, how long would it take to arrange a meeting with our remaining investors?" "All of them." "Together?" Pike looked to Cassandra, who nodded. "Maybe a week if we're lucky." "Why?" "Because rumors spread fast, but truth spreads faster when it comes from the right source." She turned to her husband. "We need to get ahead of this, not just react to it. And that means taking risks." 3 hours later, they were on horseback, heading toward the sabotage sites, Evangeline riding with the easy competence that had first caught Cassandra's attention. She'd insisted on coming, and after seeing her handle the investor crisis with the same cool calculation she'd applied to everything else, he'd realized that protecting her might mean trusting her to protect herself. "Tell me about the territory." "Campaigns," she said as they rode. "Pike mentioned you served together." Cassandra was quiet for a long moment. "Ugly business. We were supposed to be keeping peace between settlers and native tribes, but mostly we ended up fighting everyone who didn't want the government's version of progress." He glanced at her. "Why do you ask?" "Because whoever's targeting us, they're using military-style tactics. Coordinated strikes, multiple fronts, psychological warfare through the rumors. This isn't business competition. This is someone who understands how you think." The realization hit him like cold water. "Someone from my past. Someone who has reason to want you to fail." Evangeline's voice was steady, but he could see the worry in her eyes. "The question is, do they want to destroy a railroad, or do they want to destroy you?" The abandoned mining camp sat in a valley that had once bustled with activity, now reduced to empty buildings and rusted equipment that spoke of dreams gone sour. Cassandra and Evangeline approached on foot, leaving their horses tied a mile back, moving with the careful precision of people who understood they were walking into potential danger. "There," Evangeline whispered, pointing toward a building where lamplight flickered behind boarded windows. "Someone's definitely using this place." They crept closer, and through a gap in the boards, they could see inside. A man sat at a table covered with railroad maps, newspaper clippings, and what looked like correspondence. Even from behind, Cassandra recognized the military bearing, the way he held his shoulders. "Colonel Morrison," he breathed. Evangeline looked at him sharply. "You know him?" "Unfortunately." Cassandra's voice was grim. "Nathaniel Morrison." We served together in California, but he was court-martialed for selling army supplies to the highest bidder, regardless of which side they were fighting for. Last I heard, he disappeared rather than face prison. And now he's back targeting your railroad." Evangeline studied the scene through the gap. But why? Revenge? Before Cassandra could answer, a voice spoke from behind them. "Partly revenge, partly business. Mostly because I can." They spun to find Morrison himself standing 10 feet away, flanked by 2 men with the hard faces of professional killers. He looked older than Cassandra remembered, his face marked by years of hiding and resentment. But his eyes held the same cold intelligence that had made him dangerous as an officer. "Hello, Cassandra." "Still playing the noble hero, I see." Morrison. Cassandra shifted slightly, putting himself between the colonel and Evangeline. "Didn't expect you to surface again after the court-martial." "Ah, but there's where you're wrong. I never disappeared, I just got better at working from the shadows." Morrison smiled, the expression holding no warmth. "Do you have any idea how much money I've made selling information about railroad expansion to interested parties? How many fortunes I've helped build and destroy? And now you're trying to destroy mine. Not trying, succeeding. Those investors who pulled out? They received very detailed information about your, shall we say, creative accounting methods during the war. Information that might interest federal investigators." Evangeline spoke for the first time. "Except there's no creative accounting defined, is there? You're bluffing." Morrison's attention shifted to her, and his smile turned predatory. "The lovely Mrs. Royce. I wondered when I'd meet the woman who finally tamed the great Cassandra Royce. Tell me, my dear, do you know what kind of man you married? The things he did in the name of duty?" "I know he's twice the man you are," Evangeline replied steadily, though Cassandra could hear the slight tremor in her voice. "Loyalty. How touching." Morrison gestured to his men, who stepped closer. "Unfortunately, loyalty won't save either of you. You see, I've been hired to make sure the Royce Railroad never reaches California. My employers have significant investments in the current transportation monopolies." "Who's paying you?" Cassandra demanded. "Does it matter? They have deep pockets and long reach, and they've promised me enough money to disappear permanently after this is finished." Morrison pulled out a pistol. "Which, I'm afraid, includes making sure you can't identify me to anyone else." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Cassandra calculated distances and odds, his mind automatically falling into the tactical patterns that had kept him alive through multiple battles. 2 armed men plus Morrison, Evangeline to protect. Rough terrain that could provide cover if they could reach it. "You always were a coward, Morrison," he said conversationally, buying time. "Even in the army, you only fought when you had overwhelming odds in your favor. Careful, hero. I might decide to make your wife a widow slowly instead of quickly." That was a mistake. The threat to Evangeline flipped a switch in Cassandra's mind, transforming him from careful negotiator to the warrior who had earned his reputation in a dozen battles. His hand moved to his sidearm with fluid precision, but before he could draw, Evangeline stepped forward. "Colonel Morrison," she said in her most cultured voice, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Morrison's laugh was harsh. "I don't think so, Mrs. Royce. The understanding is perfectly clear. Your husband's railroad ends here, and so do both of you." But Evangeline continued as if she hadn't heard the threat, her voice carrying the trained courtesy that had been drummed into her since childhood. "You see, Colonel, while you've been focused on my husband's past, you've overlooked something rather important about his present." She reached slowly into her reticule, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Morrison's men tensed, but she merely withdrew a folded document. "Before we rode out here, I took the liberty of sending a telegram to my cousin Ophelia, you remember, the senator's wife I mentioned? It seemed she was quite interested to learn that the notorious Colonel Nathaniel Morrison had surfaced again, especially since there's still a rather substantial bounty on your head for those army supply thefts. Morrison's face darkened. You're bluffing. Am I? Evangeline unfolded the paper. This is a copy of her reply. 3 federal marshals are currently en route to this location. They should arrive. She pulled out a pocket watch. Within the hour. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Morrison's features. How could you possibly know where we were going? Because, Cassandra said quietly, understanding dawning, she planned this. The whole thing. He looked at his wife with something approaching awe. You knew we'd be followed here. Evangeline's smile was sharp as a blade. I suspected. So I made sure we'd have backup. She addressed Morrison again. The question now, Colonel, is whether you want to face those marshals, or whether you'd prefer to take the alternative I'm prepared to offer. What alternative? Safe passage out of the territory, enough money to disappear permanently, and no. Pursuit in exchange for the names of whoever hired you and a signed confession detailing your sabotage activities. Morrison's men looked between their leader and the woman who had just completely reversed the situation. One of them, clearly the smarter of the two, began backing toward the trees. You don't have the authority to make such a deal, Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Evangeline agreed, but my cousin's husband does. He's already authorized me to negotiate on behalf of the federal government. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to conversational tones. Nathaniel, may I call you Nathaniel? You're a smart man who's found himself in an impossible situation. Cut your losses, take the deal. The sound of horses approaching in the distance clinched the argument. Morrison looked toward the sound, then back at the woman who had outmaneuvered him completely. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, he said finally, they're the ones paying me. Specifically, a man named Augustus Blackstone, head of their expansion division. Cassandra nodded grimly. He'd suspected B&O involvement, but hadn't been able to prove it. And the others? Your men, your sources? Morrison rattled off names and locations with the bitter efficiency of a man who knew when he was beaten. Through it all, Evangeline took notes with the same careful attention she'd shown during business meetings. Transforming potentially deadly confrontation into administrative procedure. When the federal marshals arrived, and they did arrive, exactly as Evangeline had promised, they found a signed confession, a cooperative prisoner, and 2 accomplices, who were only too eager to testify in exchange for leniency. As Morrison was led away in shackles, he looked back at Evangeline with something like respect. You would have made a hell of an officer, Mrs. Royce. I make a better railroad executive, she replied coolly. Later, as they rode back toward town, Cassandra finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. How much of that did you actually plan? Evangeline was quiet for a long moment. The telegram to Ophelia was real. The marshals were real. The safe passage offer ... She shrugged. That was improvisation. And if Morrison had called your bluff? She turned to look at him, and he saw steel in her green eyes that matched his own. Then you would have handled it the way you handled problems in the army, and I would have helped however I could. Cassandra reined in his horse and reached for her, pulling her toward him for a kiss that tasted of danger and victory and the promise of partnership that ran deeper than either of them had expected. Evangeline Royce, he said against her lips, you are the most magnificent woman I've ever met. Just wait, she murmured back. We still have a railroad to build. 1 year later, Evangeline stood on the platform of the newly completed Millfield station, watching the first official passenger train prepare for its inaugural journey to California. The locomotive gleamed in the morning sun, a monument to ambition and determination that had overcome every obstacle thrown in its path. Quite a sight, Cassandra said, joining her on the platform. He'd been inspecting the final connections, ensuring everything was perfect for the ceremony that would officially open the Royce transcontinental line. It's beautiful, Evangeline agreed, but she wasn't looking at the train. She was watching her husband, noting how the past year had changed him. The hard edges of the warrior remained, but they'd been tempered by happiness and the deep satisfaction of building something lasting. The sabotage attempts had ended with Morrison's arrest, but the challenges hadn't. They'd faced financial crises, engineering nightmares, labor disputes, and political obstacles that would have stopped a lesser partnership. Each crisis had been met with the same combination of Cassandra's strategic brilliance and Evangeline's diplomatic finesse until the railroad community had learned to view them as a single, formidable entity. Mrs. Royce, a familiar voice called across the platform. Hiram Goldschmidt, the land speculator who'd been one of their first converts, approached with his wife and several other dignitaries. What a momentous day! You and your husband must be tremendously proud. We are, Evangeline replied, accepting congratulations with the same grace she'd brought to every aspect of their partnership. Though I suspect we're already planning the next expansion. Goldschmidt laughed. I don't doubt it. Will you be taking the inaugural journey yourselves? Only as far as the first mountain station, Cassandra said. We have business in Denver. Then we'll return to oversee the regular service launch. As the crowd grew larger, drawn by the ceremony and the promise of witnessing history, Evangeline found herself thinking about the woman who had fled from a wedding in a torn dress 1 year ago. That desperate girl seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who had discovered strength she'd never known she possessed. Ladies and gentlemen, the station master's voice boomed across the platform. All aboard for the inaugural journey of the Royce Transcontinental Line. As passengers began boarding, Cassandra took Evangeline's elbow, guiding her toward their private car. But before they reached it, a young woman in a simple dress approached them hesitantly. Excuse me, she said, her voice barely audible above the crowd noise. Are you Mrs. Royce? I am. I wanted to thank you. The girl's hands twisted nervously in her skirts. I was supposed to marry a man I didn't love, but when I heard about what you did, how you ran away and made your own life, it gave me courage to refuse. I'm working now, supporting myself, and I just wanted you to know that your story matters. Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes. What's your name? Cordelia Hartwell. Well, Cordelia Hartwell, never let anyone tell you that you can't choose your own path. Sometimes the road less traveled leads to exactly where you're meant to be. As the girl melted back into the crowd, Cassandra squeezed his wife's hand. Quite an influence you've become. We've become, she corrected. This railroad isn't just about transportation, is it? It's about connection, possibility, the chance for people to reinvent themselves somewhere new. They boarded their car as the engine's whistle split the air, signaling departure. As the train began to move, picking up speed as it left Millfield behind, Evangeline settled beside her husband and looked out at the landscape rolling past their window. Any regrets? Cassandra asked quietly. She considered the question seriously, as she did everything else. About running away from that wedding? About accepting your proposal? About spending a year building something that seemed impossible? She turned to face him fully. No regrets at all. Good. He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Because I have another proposition for you. Another railroad, among other things. His smile held mystery she was eager to explore. But first, there's something I should have said a long time ago. The train rounded a curve, and through the window they could see the mountains rising ahead of them, challenging and beautiful, and full of promise. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay California and the completion of their dream. But here in this moment, Evangeline realized she had already found everything she'd been running toward without knowing it. "I love you, Evangeline Royce," Cassandra said simply. Not as a business partner, not as a social asset, but as the woman who saw past everything I'd been to everything we could become together. "I love you too," she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Now what's this new proposition?" His grin was pure mischief. "How do you feel about building a shipping empire to complement our railroad? I hear there's quite a lot of opportunity on the Pacific coast." Evangeline laughed, the sound carrying joy and anticipation and the absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Outside their window, the American wilderness stretched endlessly toward the horizon, wild and beautiful and full of infinite possibility, just like their love.